May 16, 1943, 9:47 p.m., the Möhne Dam, Germany. The surface of the reservoir sits dark and still under a moonlit sky, holding back 140 million tons of water. Beyond the dam's massive curved wall lies the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. Factories turn out tanks, ammunition, and aircraft around the clock. The steel mills, the coal mines, the power plants, all of it depends on the water held behind this single structure and two others like it. Break these dams and you cripple the German war machine. But no one has figured out how to do it. Every conventional weapon has failed. High-altitude bombers can't hit a target this narrow with any accuracy. Torpedoes won't work because the Germans have strung heavy steel nets across the water to catch them before they reach the wall. The dams are too thick for standard bombs to penetrate, and even if a bomb did hit, it would likely bounce off or detonate too far from the structure to cause serious damage. British military planners have studied the problem for years. The conclusion is always the same. Attacking these dams is technically impossible. But Barnes Wallis doesn't accept impossible. 3 years earlier, in 1940, Wallis sat in his modest office at Vickers Armstrong's Aircraft Company in Weybridge, England. He was 53 years old, a civilian engineer with no military rank, no formal university degree, and a reputation for being stubborn to the point of obsession. He had already designed the geodetic airframe structure used in the Wellington bomber, one of the RAF's most successful aircraft. Now he was convinced he could solve a problem that had stumped every military expert in Britain. The idea came to him while watching his children skip stones across a pond near his home. The stones didn't sink immediately. They bounced across the surface, covering far more distance than if they'd been thrown straight in. Wallis stood at the water's edge and wondered, what if a bomb could do the same thing? He began filling notebooks with calculations. The concept seemed absurd on its face. Bombs are meant to fall, not bounce. But Wallis worked through the physics methodically. If you could get a cylindrical bomb spinning backwards at high speed, like a cricket ball with backspin, and release it at exactly the right altitude and distance from the target, it would skip across the water like a stone. The backspin would keep it stable, each bounce would carry it closer, and if you timed it correctly, the bomb would skip right over the torpedo nets, strike the dam wall, and sink down alongside it before detonating. The explosion would create a shock wave against the wall underwater, where the pressure would be exponentially more destructive than an explosion in open air. The theory was elegant. Making it work was another matter entirely. Wallis took his idea to the Air Ministry in late 1940. They rejected it almost immediately. Britain was fighting for survival. The Luftwaffe was bombing London every night. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. The military had no interest in experimental weapons designed by a civilian engineer, especially weapons that sounded like something from Jules Verne. Wallis was politely told to return to his day job. He ignored them. For the next 2 years, Wallis refined his design in secret, using his own money and spare time. He built scale models and tested them in a water tank at his lab. He borrowed a private lake and filmed bombs bouncing across it, adjusting the weight, the spin rate, and the release altitude with each test. He calculated the exact height the aircraft would need to fly, 60 feet above the water, low enough that one mistake would send the plane straight into the surface. He determined the optimal speed, 240 miles per hour, fast enough to cover ground, but slow enough for precision. He figured out how much backspin the bomb would need, 500 revolutions per minute, applied by a hydraulic motor before release. Every variable had to be perfect. Too high, and the bomb would break apart on impact. Too low, and the plane would crash. Too much spin, and the bomb would veer off course. Too little, and it wouldn't skip. Release it too early, and it would sink before reaching the dam. Release it too late, and it would overshoot the target. By 1942, Wallis had a working prototype. He also had a problem. He still couldn't convince anyone in the military to take him seriously. He wrote letters, he submitted reports, he gave presentations to middle-level officers who nodded politely, and did nothing. The Air Ministry filed his proposals away and forgot about them. Wallis was a civilian in a world run by military men, and no one wanted to risk their career on a weapon that might not work. Then, in February 1943, everything changed. A senior RAF officer named Sir Arthur Harris finally reviewed Wallis's proposal in detail. Harris was the head of Bomber Command, a man known for his ruthless commitment to destroying German industrial capacity. He read Wallis's calculations, watched his test footage, and made a decision. They would try it. Harris gave Wallis 3 months to finalize the bomb and train a squadron to use it. 3 months to turn a theory into a weapon. 3 months to prepare for an attack that had never been attempted before. The target? 3 dams in the Ruhr Valley. The Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorp. If the mission succeeded, it would flood the valley, destroy factories, cut off electricity, and deal a devastating blow to Germany's ability to make war. If it failed, an entire squadron of bombers and their crews would be lost for nothing. Wallis worked around the clock. The bomb was massive, 9,250 pounds of Torpex explosive encased in a cylindrical steel shell. It had to be carried in a modified Lancaster bomber with the bomb bay doors removed and a special hydraulic system installed to spin the weapon before release. The aircraft would have to fly at night, at treetop level, over heavily defended enemy territory, then drop the bomb with pinpoint accuracy while anti-aircraft guns were firing at them from both sides of the dam. It was, by any reasonable standard, a suicide mission.
The Royal Air Force formed a new squadron specifically for the mission. They call it 617 Squadron, and they staffed it with volunteers. Wing Commander Guy Gibson was chosen to lead. He was 24 years old, already a decorated pilot with years of combat experience. Gibson had flown more than 170 missions over enemy territory. He'd survived countless nights of German flak and fighter attacks. But nothing he'd done before compared to what Wallis was asking him to do now. Gibson met Wallis for the first time in March 1943 at a secure facility in Lincolnshire. Wallis explained the weapon, walked him through the physics, showed him the test footage. Gibson listened without interrupting. When Wallis finished, Gibson asked the only question that mattered. How low do we have to fly? 60 feet, Wallis said. Exactly 60 feet. Not 65, not 55. Any deviation and the bomb won't skip correctly. Gibson stared at him. 60 feet was low enough that the bomber's propellers would be churning air just above the water. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the Lancaster would cartwheel across the surface and disintegrate. And they'd have to maintain that altitude while flying 240 miles per hour toward a concrete wall, all while being shot at. At night? Gibson asked. At night, Wallis confirmed. The moon will help, but yes, at night. Gibson didn't hesitate. We'll do it. Over the next 2 months, Gibson and his crews trained relentlessly. They practiced low-level flying over British lakes and reservoirs until they could hold 60 feet in pitch darkness by instinct. They rigged spotlights under their aircraft, 2 angled beams that converged on the water at exactly 60 feet, creating a figure-8 pattern that told the pilot he was at the correct altitude. It was crude, but effective. The bombing run itself required precision that seemed almost impossible. The Lancaster had to approach the dam at exactly 240 miles per hour. The bomb aimer had to release the weapon at exactly 425 yards from the wall. Not a yard more, not a yard less. To judge that distance at night, Wallis designed a simple wooden sight with 2 nails positioned so that when the aimer looked through it, the nails would line up with the towers on either end of the dam at exactly the right distance. When the towers matched the sight, he'd release. Every element had to work perfectly. The aircraft, the crew, the bomb, the weather. One failure anywhere in the chain, and the mission would collapse. Meanwhile, Wallis dealt with the bombs themselves. The cylindrical design created problems no one had anticipated. The steel casing had to be thick enough to survive impact with the water, but light enough for the Lancaster to carry. The explosive had to be powerful enough to shatter a concrete dam, but stable enough not to detonate prematurely from the shock of bouncing across it. The hydraulic system that spun the bomb had to accelerate it to 500 revolutions per minute in a few seconds before release, then release it cleanly without throwing the aircraft off balance. Wallis tested and retested every component. He blew up scale models and water tanks. He calculated blast radii and shockwave propagation.
He consulted with demolition experts who'd never worked on anything this large. The weapon he was building wasn't just a bomb, it was a precisely engineered piece of equipment that had to function flawlessly under combat conditions. By mid-April, the bombs were ready. Gibson's crews were ready, but they still didn't know their target. Security was so tight that even Gibson wasn't told what they'd be attacking until days before the mission. The crews knew they were training for something big, something dangerous. They didn't know they were about to attempt the most technically difficult bombing raid in history. On May 15, 1943, Gibson gathered his crews for a final briefing. Maps were unrolled across tables in the operations room. For the first time, the men saw their targets, 3 dams deep in the heart of Germany. The Möhne Dam, the primary target, the Eder Dam, the secondary, and the Sorpe Dam, a backup if the first 2 operations succeeded. The route was nightmarish. They'd fly at low altitude across the North Sea to avoid radar, and then navigate through defended German airspace using moonlight and dead reckoning. They'd follow rivers and valleys to stay below radar coverage. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounded all 3 dams. German night fighters patrolled the area. And they'd be flying modified bombers that were heavier, slower, and less maneuverable than standard Lancasters because of the massive weapons slung beneath them. The room went quiet as the men absorbed what they were being asked to do. Some of them wouldn't come back. Everyone knew it. But no one walked out. Gibson addressed them simply. This is a chance to strike a real blow. If we pull this off, we'll hit Germany where it hurts. We'll save lives in the long run by shortening the war. But I won't lie to you. It's going to be the most dangerous thing any of us have ever done. That night, the ground crews loaded the bouncing bombs into 19 Lancasters. Each weapon weighed nearly 5 tons. Each aircraft carried a crew of 7 men. 133 airmen would fly into Germany that night. Mechanics made final checks on engines and hydraulics. Armorers ensured the bombs were properly secured and the spinning mechanisms were functioning. Intelligence officers provided last-minute updates on German defenses and weather conditions. Wallis stood on the airfield and watched the preparations. He'd spent 3 years developing this weapon. He'd fought through rejection, skepticism, and bureaucratic resistance. Now his invention was about to be tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable: combat. If it worked, he'd be vindicated. If it failed, 133 men would die because of his design. On May 16, 1943, the first Lancaster rolled down the runway and lifted into the darkening sky. One by one, the others followed. They formed up over the English coast, then turned east toward Germany. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to navigate by, but also making them visible to enemy fighters and gunners. Gibson's aircraft led the first wave, 9 bombers in total, heading for the Möhne Dam. They flew so low over the North Sea that spray from the waves hit their windscreens. Radio silence was absolute. Navigation was done by watching landmarks slide past in the moonlight. Rivers, forests, small towns. Any deviation from the planned route could take them over a German gun battery or into a hillside. The flight to the target took 2 hours. 2 hours of flying just above the surface, every man and every crew tense and waiting for something to go wrong. Some of the Lancasters were hit by small arms fire from German soldiers who saw the massive shapes roaring overhead. One aircraft struck power lines and crashed in flames, killing everyone before they even reached the target. The rest flew on.
At 12:15 a.m. on May 17th, Gibson's aircraft crossed into the Ruhr Valley. Below them, the landscape was a patchwork of dark forests and silver rivers under moonlight. The Möhne Reservoir spread out ahead, its surface mirror smooth. And there, cutting across the valley like a knife edge, stood the dam. Gibson circled once to survey the defenses. Flak towers flanked both sides of the structure, their guns already tracking the bombers. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the sky. The Germans knew they were coming now. They would be no surprise, no easy approach, just a straight run through a wall of fire. Gibson keyed his radio. "Hello, all cooler aircraft. I'm going into attack. Stand by to come in to attack in your order when I tell you." He brought his Lancaster around for the approach. His flight engineer called out the airspeed, 240 miles per hour, steady. The spotlights beneath the aircraft cast their twin beams on the water, forming the figure 8 that told him he was at exactly 60 feet. His bomb aimer, Spam Spafford, lay flat in the nose, peering through the wooden sight at the dam ahead. The flak opened up immediately. Tracer rounds arced up from both sides of the valley, creating streams of light that converged on Gibson's aircraft. The Lancaster shuddered as shells burst nearby. Fragments of shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. The gunners in the rear turrets returned fire, but there was no time to focus on anything except the run itself. Gibson held the aircraft steady, 240 miles per hour, 60 feet, straight at the dam. The wall grew larger in the windscreen, a massive slab of concrete that seemed to rise out of the darkness. Spafford watched through his sight as the two towers on either end of the dam slid into alignment. "Bomb gone," he shouted. The hydraulic system had already spun the cylindrical bomb to 500 revolutions per minute. When it dropped, it fell backward, spinning toward the water. The Lancaster lurched upward, suddenly 9,000 pounds lighter. Gibson pulled hard on the controls, climbing away from the dam as fast as the heavy bomber could manage. Behind them, the bomb hit the water. It bounced, once, twice, 3 times. Each impact sent up a plume of white spray that caught the moonlight. The bomb skipped across the surface, exactly as Wallis had calculated, clearing the torpedo nets, racing toward the wall. It struck the concrete face of the dam and sank alongside it, disappearing into the dark water. Gibson was already 200 yards past the dam when the bomb exploded. The explosion was enormous, but the wall hadn't broken. Gibson could see water pouring through cracks in the concrete, but the structure held. One bomb wasn't enough. "Cooler 2, you're next," Gibson radioed. "Go in and attack now." The second Lancaster, piloted by Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, began its approach. The German gunners were fully alert now, and they concentrated their fire on the incoming bomber. Hopgood pushed through the flak, holding his altitude and speed steady. His bomb aimer released right on target. The bomb skipped toward the dam. But Hopgood's aircraft had taken heavy damage. An engine was on fire. Flames streamed back from the wing. The Lancaster was losing altitude. Hopgood fought to keep it airborne long enough for his crew to bail out, but the bomber was disintegrating around them. It crashed into the ground a mile past the dam and exploded. Only 2 of the 7 crew members survived. The bomb Hopgood released struck the dam and detonated, sending another massive column of water skyward. Gibson circled again. The wall was still standing. The explosion had been enormous, but the wall hadn't broken. Gibson could see water pouring through cracks in the concrete, but the structure held. They needed more hits. "Cooler 3, your turn." Flight Lieutenant McMartin made his run. The flak was now so thick that it seemed impossible any aircraft could fly through it. Martin's aircraft was hit repeatedly, but he held his course. His bomb aimer released the weapon. It skipped perfectly across the water and detonated against the dam wall. Another explosion, another tower of water. Gibson watched, waiting to see if this would be the one. The dam held. Martin pulled away, his aircraft trailing smoke but still flying. Gibson called in the 4th Lancaster, piloted by squadron leader Melvin Young. Young had flown with Gibson on dozens of missions. If anyone could make a perfect run under these conditions, it was him. Young's approach was textbook. He flew straight through the flak without deviating an inch. His bomb aimer released at exactly the right moment. The bomb skipped 4 times and struck the dam dead center. The explosion was perfectly placed right where the previous bombs had already weakened the structure. Gibson watched from 800 yards away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, a section of the dam wall bulged outward. Concrete cracked with a sound like thunder, and suddenly, catastrophically, the Möhne Dam broke. A triangular section of the wall, 100 feet wide at the top, simply gave way. 140 million tons of water held back for decades found the opening and punched through. The breach widened as thousands of tons of water per second hammered at the damaged concrete. Within minutes, a gap 250 feet wide had opened. The entire reservoir was emptying into the Ruhr Valley below. Gibson circled lower to watch. The water formed a wall of 30 feet high, racing down the valley at 20 miles per hour. It swept away everything in its path. Houses, factories, bridges, roads, all of it disappeared beneath the flood. Power stations went dark as the water hit them. Railway lines twisted like string. The wave rolled on for miles, carrying debris and destruction with it. The airmen in Gibson's Lancaster stared in silence. They'd done it. The impossible weapon had worked. 3 years of calculations, months of training, and 4 perfectly placed bombs had accomplished what everyone said couldn't be done. But the mission wasn't over. Gibson radioed back to base, "Goner, goner," the code word that meant the Möhne Dam had been breached. Then he called up the remaining aircraft in his formation. They still had 2 more dams to attack. The Eder would next, and it would prove even more difficult than the first.
The 5 remaining Lancasters of Gibson's formation turned south, following valleys and rivers toward their secondary target. Behind them, the Ruhr Valley was drowning. Ahead, more guns were waiting, and somewhere over Germany, the second and third waves of bombers were fighting their way toward their own targets, trying to survive long enough to reach the dams they'd been assigned. The night was far from over.
The Eder Dam sat in a different valley, 40 miles south of the Möhne. Unlike the first target, it had no flak towers. The Germans had assumed the terrain itself would protect it. The dam was surrounded by steep hills covered in thick forest. Any aircraft trying to attack it would have to dive into the valley, drop to 60 feet while banking hard to line up with the target, release the bomb with precision, then pull up sharply to avoid slamming into the hillside on the far side. In daylight, with unlimited attempts, it would be challenging. At night, with one chance to get it right, it was nearly suicidal. Gibson arrived over the Eder at 1:39 a.m. He orbited high above the valley, studying the approach. The moon lit the reservoir clearly, but the hills cast deep shadows. The dam itself was a curved wall of concrete nestled between 2 steep slopes. There was barely enough room to maneuver. He called in squadron leader Henry Maudsley to make the first attack. Maudsley was an experienced pilot, calm under pressure. If anyone could navigate this approach, it was him. But his first attempt failed. He came in too high, couldn't line up the shot, and had to abort. He circled around and tried again. Still too high. The hills forced him to approach at an angle that made it impossible to judge the release point accurately. Gibson watched Maudsley make a third attempt. This time, the Lancaster dove into the valley, banked hard, and leveled out just above the water. It looked good. Maudsley held steady. His bomb aimer released. But something went wrong. The bomb hit the water late, bounced erratically, and struck the top of the dam wall instead of skipping down to the base. It exploded prematurely, right as Maudsley's Lancaster was pulling up over the structure. The blast caught the aircraft from below. Gibson saw the Lancaster stagger in the air, trailing flames. Maudsley tried to gain altitude, but the damage was catastrophic. His radio crackled with a brief, broken transmission, then went silent. The bomber flew on for several miles before it crashed into the German countryside. All 7 crew members died. Gibson called in Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon next. Shannon made 6 attempts to line up the shot. 6 times he dove into the valley only to pull up because the angle wasn't right or the altitude was off. Each failed run brought him closer to exhaustion. Flying at 60 feet through a narrow valley in darkness, making hairpin turns to set up another approach took every ounce of skill and concentration a pilot had. One moment of inattention meant death. On Shannon's 7th attempt, he finally got the geometry right. His bomb aimer released. The weapon skipped cleanly across the water and detonated against the dam. A huge plume of water rose into the moonlight. Gibson circled to assess the damage. The explosion had been perfect, but the Eder was even thicker than the Möhne. The wall was cracked but intact. They needed another hit. Squadron leader Les Knight made his approach. He'd watched Shannon's struggles and learned from them. Knight flew a nearly perfect run on his first attempt. His bomb skipped 4 times and struck the dam precisely where Shannon had weakened it. The explosion sent a shock wave rippling across the reservoir. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the center of the dam wall began to crumble. Chunks of concrete the size of houses broke away and tumbled into the valley below. Water poured through the gaps, widening them with immense pressure. Within minutes, the Eder Dam had a breach 70 feet wide. The reservoir began to empty. Gibson radioed base again. Goner. Goner. 2 dams destroyed. But the cost was mounting. They'd lost Hopgood at the Möhne, Maudsley at the Eder. Other aircraft from the 2nd and 3rd waves had been shot down on their way to the Sorp Dam or had crashed during the low-level flight across German territory. Young's aircraft, despite making it through both dam attacks, would be shot down on the return flight. Martin's badly damaged Lancaster would barely make it back to England. At 4:30 a.m., Gibson turned his remaining aircraft toward home. They flew north, still at low altitude to avoid radar and fighters. Behind them, 2 massive floods were tearing through German industrial regions. The water from the Möhne had already destroyed or damaged more than 100 factories. Power plants were offline, coal mines were flooded, transportation networks were severed. The water from the Eder was adding to the devastation, racing down a parallel valley and overwhelming towns that had no warning. The 3rd dam, the Sorp, had been attacked by other aircraft in the squadron but hadn't broken. Its different construction, an earthen core rather than solid concrete, made it more resistant to the kind of shockwave damage the bouncing bombs produced. But 2 out of 3 was still a historic success. Gibson's Lancaster crossed back over the North Sea as dawn began to break in the east. His crew hadn't spoken much during the return flight. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and nerves. They'd witnessed friends die. They'd accomplished something no one thought possible. They'd also unleashed destruction on a scale that was difficult to fully comprehend. At 4:15 a.m., Gibson landed at RAF Scampton. As he climbed out of his aircraft, ground crews gathered to hear what had happened. Barnes Wallis was there too, waiting anxiously. He'd spent the entire night pacing, smoking cigarettes, and listening to fragmentary radio reports. When Gibson confirmed that both the Möhne and the Eder were destroyed, Wallis broke down. The weapon he had invented had worked, but it had also cost the lives of 53 young men who'd flown into Germany and never came back. Of the 19 Lancasters that had taken off the night before, only 11 returned. 8 aircraft were lost. 53 airmen killed, 3 captured. Gibson would be awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. 33 other crew members would receive medals. The mission would be celebrated as one of the most daring raids in RAF history. But in the immediate aftermath, Wallis couldn't shake the human cost. He'd designed a weapon that required men to fly at 60 feet through enemy fire, trusting that his calculations were correct. Every man who died had been carrying his invention. Years later, when asked about the raid, Wallis would say it was the greatest success of his career and the worst night of his life. The attack itself had immediate strategic effects. German industrial production in the Ruhr Valley dropped significantly. More than 1,600 civilians in the valley died in the floods, along with nearly 1,000 forced laborers and prisoners of war who'd been housed near the dams. The Germans diverted thousands of workers to repair the damage, taking them away from other war work. They also pulled anti-aircraft guns from other locations to protect the remaining dams, weakening defenses elsewhere. But the larger impact was psychological. The raid proved that no target was truly invulnerable. German military leadership had considered the dams impossible to attack. Now 2 of them were rubble. The sense of invincibility that had pervaded Nazi military thinking took a serious blow. And for the British public, still enduring rationing and bombing, the Dam Busters raid offered proof that Britain could strike back in a dramatic fashion. Barnes Wallis returned to his office at Vickers Armstrong's in the days following the raid and tried to process what had happened. He was 55 years old, a civilian engineer who'd never served in combat, never fired a weapon in anger, never seen the kind of destruction his invention had unleashed. Now he was responsible for one of the most spectacular bombing raids in history, and the deaths of dozens of young men who'd trusted his calculations with their lives. The newspapers called him a genius. Military officials praised his innovation. The public embraced him as a hero who'd struck a blow against Nazi Germany. But Wallis felt the weight of those 53 deaths more than any accolade. He wrote letters to the families of the men who'd been killed, trying to explain that their sons and husbands had accomplished something extraordinary. The letters were awkward and painful to write. What could he say that would matter to a mother who'd lost her child? He threw himself back into his work. That was what he'd always done when faced with impossible problems. The bouncing bomb had worked, but Wallis already saw its limitations. It required perfect conditions, exceptional crews, and a willingness to accept heavy casualties. The weapon was too specialized, too dependent on variables that couldn't always be controlled. He began sketching designs for other weapons, other ways to penetrate hardened targets without requiring men to fly at 60 feet through walls of flak. Over the next 2 years, Wallis would develop the Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, massive earthquake bombs weighing up to 22,000 pounds. These weapons didn't bounce. They fell from high altitude and penetrated deep underground before detonating, creating shock waves that could collapse tunnels, destroy submarine pens, and crack the foundations of reinforced structures. They were safer to deploy and more versatile than the bouncing bomb. They would be used hundreds of times before the war ended. But nothing Wallis designed would ever capture the public imagination quite like the bouncing bomb. There was something almost mythical about it, a weapon that skipped across water like a stone thrown by a child, yet carried enough explosive power to shatter dams and change the course of rivers.
It embodied the kind of lateral thinking that wars sometimes demanded, the willingness to look at a problem from an entirely new angle when conventional approaches had failed. The raid also revealed something about the nature of innovation in wartime. Wallis wasn't part of the military establishment. He had no access to classified research, no team of scientists working under him, no government funding. He was an aircraft designer who'd spent his own money testing an idea that military experts had dismissed as impractical. The fact that his weapon worked, and worked brilliantly, was a testament to persistence in the face of institutional skepticism. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how wars are fought and what price is acceptable to pay for strategic advantage. The bouncing bomb required extraordinary bravery from the men who delivered it. The low-altitude flying, the precision timing, the need to hold steady while being shot at from multiple directions, all of it pushed human endurance and skill to their limits. Of the 133 men who flew on the raid, 40% didn't come home. That casualty rate would have been unacceptable in almost any other context. It was accepted here, because the target mattered, and because the men who flew knew what they were volunteering for. Guy Gibson, who'd led the raid and survived it, would be killed in action 18 months later during a different mission. He was 26 years old. Many of the other Dam Busters crew members would die before the war ended. The 617 Squadron continued to fly high-risk missions throughout the war, using both conventional bombs and Wallis's later designs. They became known as an elite unit, the squadron you sent when a target absolutely had to be destroyed, regardless of the cost. The German response to the dam attacks was swift and comprehensive. They rebuilt the Möhne Dam within 5 months, working around the clock with thousands of laborers. They installed additional anti-aircraft defenses around all remaining dams and critical infrastructure. They developed early warning systems and repositioned fighter squadrons to respond more quickly to low-altitude raids. The window of vulnerability that had allowed the dam busters to succeed closed quickly. A similar raid attempted later in the war would likely have faced much heavier defenses and even higher casualties. This raised another uncomfortable truth. The raid's success depended partly on German unpreparedness. They hadn't anticipated an attack on the dams because they'd assumed it was impossible. Once they realized it wasn't, they adapted. Innovation in warfare often has a short shelf life. The advantage goes to whoever thinks of something first, but that advantage evaporates the moment the enemy understands what you've done and develops countermeasures. Wallis understood this better than most. He never stopped innovating because he knew that any weapon, no matter how effective, would eventually be countered. The bouncing bomb worked once, spectacularly, but it was already obsolete by the time the dams were rebuilt. His earthquake bombs represented the next evolution, weapons that didn't require suicidal bravery to deliver, that could be dropped from safe altitudes, and that were effective at a wider range of targets. After the war ended, Wallis continued working in aerospace engineering. He contributed to the design of supersonic aircraft and helped develop early concepts for space exploration. He lived to be 92 years old, dying in 1979, long enough to see the world transformed by technologies he'd helped pioneer. But whenever anyone asked him about his career, the conversation always came back to the bouncing bomb and the raid on the dams. In his later years, Wallis would reflect on the moral complexity of his work. He'd designed weapons that killed people. That was the unavoidable reality of being an engineer during wartime. The bouncing bomb had destroyed dams, which had flooded valleys, which had killed more than 1,600 people who happened to be living in the path of the water. Some of them were German civilians. Some of them were foreign workers forced into labor by the Nazi regime. The weapon didn't discriminate. Wallis never tried to justify those deaths or minimize them. He acknowledged that war created impossible choices and that his invention had been part of a larger machinery of violence. He also believed genuinely that shortening the war saved more lives than it cost. The debate over strategic bombing and its effectiveness would continue long after he was gone, with historians and ethicists arguing about whether raids like the Dam Busters truly contributed to Allied victory or simply added to the overall destruction. What's not debatable is the technical achievement. Wallis took an idea that seemed absurd, a bomb that bounces, and turned it into a functional weapon through meticulous calculation and relentless testing. He solved problems that no one else had even attempted, and he did it not because he was following orders or fulfilling a military contract, but because he believed it was possible and refused to accept that it wasn't.